So the main question that I address in my research on character is the question of why we don't always defer to the people that we should, and also what can be done about that. So when I think about deference, I think about us listening to people and believing what they're telling us because they're saying so. So there are a number of questions you can ask about that virtue of deference. Of course, the one question I've been interested in is how can we promote that virtue? So in general, I'll think about stuff like you have certain people who know what they're talking about. What can those people do for the purpose of getting us to defer to them and thereby become better off, become more informed, and so forth, and manifest this virtue of epistemic deference as a result? So as for the answers to this question that I've discovered so far, I happen to be the kind of philosopher that wants to interact with the sciences, and I'm lucky enough not to have to do the science on my own. There's a lot of science already out there, a lot of empirical work done, particularly in social psychology, that I'm lucky enough to be able to go in and harvest the philosophical take-home messages from. And roughly what I've found so far is that it seems that one important reason that we listen to people is that they in turn listen to us. So if we were to think of this in terms of a slogan in relation to the virtue of deference, of deferring to the people that we should, is that people listen to people who listen. So we can think about this, for example, in such controversial cases where you have a breakdown of trust, such as in relation to climate change or the debate between creationists and evolutionary theorists. Here you have situations where we can assume that one party to the debate, they know what they're talking about, but a wide array of people don't believe what they're being told. So in that kind of situation, where there is, if you want, a problem of deference, we have a case where people should be deferring to people who know what they're talking about, but they don't. How in that kind of case can you try to set up situations, discussions, social structures in a way that will promote deference in cases where people might be reluctant to defer? And that would be the kind of model that you want to set up a situation where people will feel that their point of view is being taken into account, that they're being listened to, and that in turn, this kind of research would predict, would not only have the people listening instantiate a virtue relating to some kind of fairness in relation to the people that they're talking to, but would also be conducive to the people being talked to, the people that are listening and that we want to defer, to be able to do so, to feel that they're in a situation where they're being heard, and as such, they would be more prepared to in turn listen and instantiate a epistemic virtue of deference as a result. So as for where my research on character is heading, I'm interested in the conditions under which it's epistemically appropriate to defer to others. So epistemically appropriate in the sense of in the domain of coming to know things, coming to become informed, believing things truly. When is it appropriate to defer to others? So we can ask questions, and philosophers have, for example, about does it need to be the case that if I listen to you and you're a reliable source, do I need to know that you're a reliable source for it to be appropriate for me to defer to you? Or is it simply sufficient that you know what you're talking about, whether or not I have any evidence to that effect? So I tend to think that the only thing that's necessary is really that the person that you're consulting with knows what he or she is talking about. That's sufficient for it to be appropriate for you to defer to her, whether or not you have any evidence. So a lot of philosophers consider this a controversial point of view. The way I like to think about it is, I like to think about epistemic virtue roughly in the way of British philosopher John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill was not a virtue epistemologist or a virtue ethicist for that matter, but he had a virtue theory that I think is helpful in these contexts. And his virtue theory was roughly that virtues are dispositions that promote goods. So if we think about epistemic virtues, virtues relating to knowledge, true belief, and so forth, epistemic virtues would be dispositions on the part of believers to reliably come to believe things, for example, to be such that they will reliably come to believe what's true, for example. So if the name of the game is true belief here, if the name in this epistemic game is true belief, then it seems what matters here is whether or not we're listening to people who know what they're talking about, who are informed, who are reliable sources on the relevant matters. Now, critical reflection, evidence, and so forth might, in many cases, be a good idea, but there's no necessity in there. What matters is whether or not we're listening to people who know what they're talking about. And in some cases, reflecting on that matter is going to be a good thing. In other cases, it's not going to be a good thing. It's not going to be a good thing when we're not very good at reflecting, when we don't really know the relevant matters as well as the people we're deferring to. So what I'm interested in is to see how far you can take this point and whether you can take this all the way to there being something epistemically appropriate, at least by possibility, with something like a blind deference. So a kind of deference where we don't have any information whatsoever about the source being reliable, but it nevertheless being appropriate that we defer to that person. Why is it important in general to study character? Well, I think when we study character, we find something out about what we as individual agents bring to the table in any given form of inquiry. And that's important because we also, at least as philosophers and epistemologists who think about knowledge and true belief and other epistemic goods that we value, we also want to think about how can we become better at attaining these things. And of course, an important part to that larger puzzle is to understand the contribution that we make to attaining these things. Now, I think importantly, it's not the only piece of that puzzle. I think another important component is also our social environment. So in some cases, it's going to be that we come to know something, that we come to find something out, to become informed, because it's something that we do, some character trait, some excellence, some virtue on our part. In other cases, it's going to be that we come to believe something that is true, we come to know something, thanks to our social environment, thanks to, say, our peer informing us, or to there being certain methodological constraints imposed on us. Think about, for example, the kind of methodological constraints that is operative in a scientific context on the scientists. So sometimes we're going to be knowing things and coming to succeed in the epistemic realm because of something that is not primarily ascribable to us, but more to our social environment. So I think when I think about character, I think about it as part of this larger puzzle. I want to think about how these different pieces fit together, and all for the purpose of thinking about how we can get better at attaining epistemic goods like true belief and knowledge and so forth, be it through some excellence on our own part or on the part of some beneficial feature of our social environment.